Hi everyone, thank you for joining us today for the second part of our Risk and Leadership webinar series. Today I'll be discussing risk, leadership and diversity. First we'll hear Geoff Trickey, Managing Director at PCL, talk about how we understand risk personality. Then we're excited to have Sue Stockdale talk about how men and women approach risk and decision making differently and how this impacts leadership. Sue is a motivational speaker, executive coach and record-breaking explorer, having been the first British woman to ski to the magnetic North Pole. Please feel free to submit any questions during the presentations using the functionality on the right-hand side of your screen, and we'll get to as many of those as possible at the end of the presentations. So now I'm going to hand over to Geoff.
Hello, my name is Geoff Trickey. I'm Managing Director at PCL. That's a company, a firm of business psychologists, been in existence nearly 25 years now. And we have a particular interest and expertise in personality and the psychology of personality and in test development. We were the first company to develop a testing platform on the internet in the UK. So we're an innovative company, we're research oriented, and today we have systems integrations and web services linking us around the world. And we have a global influence as well through our global clients and a strong business involvement in North America and Africa and in Australia. Okay, making sense of risk. The point about risk is it is a very complicated area. The more you get into it, the more fluid everything seems to be. One of the main difficulties in navigating risk is to do with the language, the way we use the language and the words, and the ambiguity that's inherent in some of that. Originally, risk was about, the emphasis in risk was about probability. It's always a balance. The meaning of risk is always takes account of probability, and it also takes account of danger. But initially, the emphasis was on probability, and success or opportunity and failure were pretty evenly balanced at that time. I'm thinking pretty much about the origins of the insurance industry in the City of London, in the coffee houses of the City of London, where insurance was trying to say, well, what was at stake here? But it was that sort of balance between opportunity, very much so, and danger. And the balance between those two seems to have changed quite dramatically. There's a picture here of the usage of the words risk and danger in publications since 1800, you can see, and something in the 70s happened to the word risk, if you look at that. So an exponential increase in the use of the word risk. And that seems to be because up until that point, all of the legislation around risk had actually been focusing on safety and danger and safety at work and so on. And what had happened since the first of those pieces of legislation, usually framed around the employment of children in factories and the conditions of employment and so on and their safety, all that legislation was very, very specific. It was about what age you should employ people, how long they should work, whether you should turn the machines off when they're being maintained, whether you should ventilate the factories and so on. And over the years, that spread throughout most of industry, and that had been the approach. So by the mid-70s, there was a vast legislative body of information about what was allowed and what wasn't allowed across the world of employment, really. And at that point, the situation changed quite dramatically because of that complexity and the desire to simplify the situation. And so from that point, in the UK in particular, the Robbins report was very influential, which really wanted to make a generalized principle of it, so that the problem for going forward, the risk arising from, as they put it, the conduct of an undertaking was the issue. So it became what was a risk and what wasn't was not specified in advance, in other words. If someone did something and it created a risk for somebody else, then that was the issue. So it became unspecific, it became open-ended, it became undefined until the courts actually decided one way or the other that had been a problem. So risk at that point became viewed just as a danger. So it became very one-sided. And in fact, if you're reading about risk, you have to be very careful, because risk is often used as a synonym for danger without particular reference to the other aspects of risk, which of course is the probability. So risk is bad. I mean, I think we are a pretty risk-averse society these days, with super alert to every kind of risk available. The point is, though, that risk is actually a feature of the human condition. It's with us all of the time. Every act that we take has a risk element to it, and is something that we live with from the cradle to the grave. And we deal with it quite routinely. And skills and knowledge reduce the uncertainty and what isn't a risk. So this is the second complication. The first one is language. The second one is that risk is not a constant. Our interaction with it, our daily interactions with it, changes what is a risk and what isn't a risk to us. It may look different to somebody else, as in this particular example. Here's somebody who's taking a risk. To them, it may be not a risk at all. They could have been doing that every day for the last 30 years, for all we know. But the passers-by saw it as a violation of health and safety behaviours, and they were actually in trouble for what they were doing. The second example is somebody doing something which, on the face of it, looks equally dangerous, but it's fine. No prosecution in that case. They will have a license to perform in public places, and you can see they're on a 10-foot high motorcycle. They're juggling with flaming torches, and their little children sitting around happily watching the exhibition. So risk, changes with experience. In either of those cases, I'm assuming that they both know what they're doing, although the first of those causes offence because it breaks a particular law, but the second one doesn't. So you can see the sort of arbitrariness of it. The point about it is, though, that risks change with experience. What was once a risk can become a pleasure. So the obvious examples are in recreational activities like bike riding and skiing. We start off with something we're fearful of, and gradually we master it. So skills and knowledge then change the scene. So it changes the uncertainty. It's uncertain. One of the issues about risk is when we don't know, how can we estimate what is the issue? But if you obviously, the more you know about something, and the more tangible it is, and the more the less of a risk it becomes. So the unthinkable becomes thinkable, and the undoable becomes doable. So for a child there on the left, we learn, we negotiate, navigate risk, and we go on to do it all our lives. And on the right, the books of knowledge that help us to understand our world and enable us to do all the kinds of things that in the present modern world we need to do. So the point is that risk is absolutely unavoidable. It's a fluid part of of our existence. It's a central part of the human condition, every minute, every day throughout life. So how do we get to grips with that then? Well, what you're looking for is something in all of that which is relatively stable, some point that you can really get hold of as a starting point for understanding risk. And the clue here is in the blue arrows. Personality gives us an opportunity, because risk behavior reflects our personality, as does all our behavior. So risk behavior and attitudes and perceptions all really are fed by our personality on a day-to-day basis, and that personality is rooted partly in our genetics. We never know exactly what the equation is, but a significant part of personality is inherited, it's heritable. And there is this long-established association with personality and risk. It seems that if you read about books about risk, then it would almost inevitably refer at some point to personality. If you read books about personality, it always inevitably at some point refer to risk-taking as an aspect of personality. So we've been familiar with that relationship, but no one has finally seen it as causal. And part of that, I think, is because the variable of risk has always been very fluid. It's never been very solid. It's always, usually it's just a question of asking candidates in research whether or not they're risk takers. So just a subjective response. So the tightness of that relationship wasn't appreciated. And that's the basis of our research over the last 7 years, is making that link, the causal link between personality and the risks that we take and the way we behave in risky situations. We now have data, well, more like 10,000 completions of risk type compass questionnaire, which is what we're talking about today. This is a quote from the UK government chief scientific advisor, which is fortunately kind of reflects the approach we took in our research with personality. The point he makes is that decision making always draws from two parts of the brain, the analytic part and the emotional part, and also that we make decisions instinctively. This is how we see the relationship then between personality and behavior. At the bottom, the anchor is stable, but if we're looking at a boat which is tethered to the anchor from the shore, it's not quite clear where that anchor is initially. The boat's getting buffeted by the waves and by the wind, and moving up and down with the tides, but gradually you will realize where the influence of personality is having its effect over time. And that's the way we see personality influencing behavior. Behavior isn't rigidly choreographed by our personality, obviously. You may be an extrovert, you may be an introvert. It doesn't prevent you from having social skills or for developing an ability to engage with people that isn't as natural for some people than for others. So personality is all about dispositions. But the point, a really crucial point about that is the influence is persistent. Your personality is rooted very deeply in your nature, and its influence is persistent and it's pervasive. However big or small it is, it's always there ticking away and influencing you in a particular direction. So what that amounts to is that every individual has their own behavioral risk bias. There is a tendency towards, however much we deal with risks and get familiar with them, there's still always that sort of tendency to move one way or the other. So that thinking is the basis of the risk type compass. If you look at the compass on the screen now, if you imagine a line going from intense, say, up at 11 o'clock down to composed at 5 o'clock, well, that's an axis of emotionality. People at the intense category, or the intense part of that compass, are people who are very emotional. They react in strong ways to risk. They're very risk averse and quite fearful, and they tend to be apprehensive about any new situation. At the other end, the people who are the most composed, and we're going from one extreme to another here, but at the most composed, they're absolutely calm. They don't see themselves as frightened. I was reading something, an interview with Nicky Lauder, that a friend sent to me yesterday, and he specifically says, I don't feel fear. And in that interview, it seems amazing to most of us, but that seems to be the case. So you can be quite oblivious in an emotional sense to fear. On the other hand, there's another way of looking at risk, which is the axis which would go from 2 o'clock, the prudent, down to 8 o'clock, the carefree. And that's about how much you need to know, how to understand, how analytic you are about things. The most prudent people are people who don't do anything unless they're quite clear and sure about how they should be doing it. They do things by the book. They do it to the letter. They don't do anything in a spontaneous sort of way, and they don't do anything without permission. I'm talking again, very extreme. But then the continuum goes all the way through to the carefree at 8 o'clock, the carefree risk type, and they're the most extreme, are the absolute opposite. They don't like to know what's happening tomorrow because it will ruin it for them. They love the unknown. They love to be spontaneous and impulsive. They like to challenge the way things traditionally are being done by the prudent people at the other end of the scale. So those are the two axes, and those two axes give you actually a 360-degree spectrum of risk dispositions, if you like, based on those two fundamental underlying measures. So at the top of the scale then, go to the top of the list on your left, the wary risk type, which is also top of the compass. They have two reasons for being risk averse. They're risk averse because they're fearful and anxious, and they're also risk averse because they don't like doing something they don't understand and don't know. So they have two reasons for being risk averse. So that would be our most risk averse grouping. And then the people more towards the bottom of the compass, the adventurous types, have two reasons why they will embrace risk more readily. And the first, the obvious one, is the carefree type, because they love risk. Excitement seeking is what they are all about. And the composed type, which also would contribute to the adventurous group, are people who are, as we've said, can be almost oblivious to risk, and fear is an unknown to them. So the adventurous types have two reasons why they might be particularly risk-taking. And then the others fall into place. The prudent and the excitable and the deliberate too are both kind of, we would say, moderate risk takers, and because they're halfway down the compass. At the top it's the most risk averse, at the bottom are the most risk taking. But they are again shaped or defined by the contributing factors either side of them, the prudence and the composure, or the tense and the carefree. So that gives us our eight risk types. The point about this is then that risk is a personal agenda, and it's driven by our personalities. It's a persistent and pervasive influence. It's consistent behavioral bias. And so the challenges of leadership or of anything else, whatever we're doing in our lives and how we're trying to extend our capability in life and our effectiveness in life, those challenges are all person specific. So generally the applications for all of this have been very varied, really, because risk is an aspect of almost everything. But currently it's being used in auditor training, financial advising, a lot of work in board development. I think you can see the benefits of balance on a board. Risk management per se, the profession of risk management, sports psychology, heavy industry where it's mostly a matter of health and safety, but it's about how do you get people to take personal responsibility for that, and that has to relate to their risk type. Trader coaching, which you had one of I think the first in this recent series of webinars was exactly on that subject, and risk culture change. So I hope that gives you a bit of an insight into what Sue Stockdale has been using in her professional life.
Thank you, Geoff. Is it over to me now?
It is. You're on.
Great. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to you all. I hope that you will enjoy the next few minutes. I'll be sharing a little bit of my experiences in terms of risk, leadership, and diversity. And to kind of get that started, I think it would be useful to understand what risk-taking means to you in business. And if I can get the slides to change, I'm not sure if I'm in presenter mode here, Jackie.
Yes, yep, you should be.
Okay.
You can click on the side, yep.
That's right, there we are, okay. So I'd like you just to think about for a moment in terms of what risk-taking means for you as a leader in business. Does it mean that how do you get other people to follow you as a leader? Is it about how to work with people who are different to you? Perhaps a risk for you is about showing vulnerability as a leader. And there can be really many, many ways that the concept of risk plays out on a day-to-day basis at work. And as Geoff said, what seems risky to one person might not seem risky to another. And what I'm going to talk to you today about is looking at risk types and how that influences females' behaviour and also women working with men in organisations. So we're going to look at two different aspects. First of all, executives in organisations, and secondly, entrepreneurs running fast growth companies. And I hope that by the end of it, you'll get some more insight that from your own perspective, perhaps as a leader, how you can be even more effective in your role with that cognizance of how risk plays a factor in how you lead. Well, you might be sitting there thinking, well, what does Sue know about risk-taking? And I suppose to just explain a bit about my background, and I've got about 19 years of experience working in organisations, both as a coach and a leadership development specialist. And I've worked a lot of the time with female leaders in all around the world, both in the corporate level and entrepreneurs running fast growth businesses. Having written 2 books on the subject, and then more recently a joint book with Clive Steeper, who did the earlier webinar on the subject of risk. And I'll talk a little bit more about that book later on. It would be useful for us just to get a sense of who is in the webinar today, who's listening to the conversation. So we'll do a little bit of a poll now, and if you'd like to look on the screen, you can see that there are 5 different options. Perhaps you're a leader in the corporate world that's listening in today, or maybe you're an entrepreneur or work in a smaller type of business. Maybe you're a leader in public sector, or you're a consultant or coach, or you're just generally interested in leadership. So I'd like you to have a look on the screen, if you can see the screen in front of you, and click on the option that determines what your background is. And then we'll be able to show the results of that poll in a moment or two when you click on the poll in front of you. And then Jackie will show up who's listening in today. And it'll just give us a sense of the background of the participants on the webinar. If you're listening to this later on, I'm sure then you'll be able to see the results in a minute to see who was on the webinar also that you're listening to today. So we've mostly got consultants and coaches on, and people that are generally interested in leadership. So that gives us a good sense of who's listening in to the webinar. So we'll move on in a minute to the next slide and see if we think about females and women as risk takers. Are women risky or are they reckless? We move on to the next slide. There we are. Well, there's quite a lot of research and data out there to show that, particularly among entrepreneurs and leaders of fast-growing companies, women do see risks differently to men. However, like men, they're very much risk takers. And as you can see from this slide in front of you, some research done by the Centre for Entrepreneurs in Barclays here in the UK showed that in many different facets of how one might describe oneself, women definitely see themselves as risk takers. If we think about it, I'll just go back to the earlier slide here, if I can. If we think about it from a board perspective, and in the corporate world, both women and men can add value as leaders in the boardroom. And there is some recent research by Catalyst that shows that companies with a greater number of women on the board outperform those with a fewer number of women on the board in no less than 3 financial measures, which is often the way that companies are measured in terms of their success, of course. And you can see on this slide that return on equity, 53% higher, sales 42% higher, and return on invested capital 66% higher. When there is that special power of 3, more than 3 women on the board are certainly showing that they were likely to produce stronger than average results. So I think that's certainly worth paying attention to from a board perspective. How about from high growth business then? This is an entrepreneurial space. Again, it shows that women do run fast growing businesses. However, they execute the growing of the business in a different way. And one of the recent examples I heard about how this actually plays out in reality, I heard of 2 companies operating in the same sector. Both companies, at an early stage of the growth of their company, were offered venture capital to fast track the growth of the company. Now, one company had 2 male directors and 1 female director, and they opted for the funding, whereas the other company that had 2 female directors opted to take the organic growth route. And what they had factored into their decision was that they had young children and they were concerned about the impact on their family of being so focused on a fast growth trajectory. So it's not to say that one is right and one is wrong. It's just interesting that for one company, they took their approach into consideration wider aspects of their business. And I think that that is certainly something that I've seen over the years that is definitely prevalent when women are leading organizations. Now you might think about, well, how do those risk types that Geoff talked about earlier, how do they play out in reality? And here's a slide that shows the gender differences when we look at the risk type compass in particular. It certainly shows that women's risk types tend to be wary, prudent and intense. And they scored higher generally in sensitivity, warmth and anxiety. Men's risk types tended to be deliberate, adventurous and excitable. and they scored higher in emotional stability, dominance, rule consciousness, and vigilance. If you look across all of the risk types, though, there is a good spread in all types of both genders. And for me, that really is the key message from a leadership perspective, that we need to be able to value and recognise the benefits of having that diversity of propensity for risk-taking and approach to risk-taking, both from women and men in a team. If you look then, if you kind of took us as a human race, team Homo sapiens, again, across the population, there is pretty much a broad spread of each risk type. And therefore, again, are we playing to that diversity in the way that we lead and organise our teams and our businesses, and the people that we're coaching as well, if we're a consultant or coach? However, one of the things that is different in terms of gender is what happens to people when they're taking risks under stress. And as you can imagine from some of the work that I've done, and I didn't mention it in my background introduction, that as a polar explorer, you can imagine that that is a fairly stressful environment. And you can see the different approaches in terms of how men and women will take different types of risks. For example, this research quotes that male risk-taking tends to increase under stressful situations, while female risk-taking tends to decrease. And this is to do with the brain and the particular regions of the brain that are involved in computing risk and preparing to take action. Now again, this idea of doing things differently, I've seen played out time and time again within organisations. And I'm going to just give you an example of 3 different environments where I see that the example or the description of risk is viewed differently. First of all, I was heading up a program where we were targeting women running high growth companies. And when we described what we were looking for in those sorts of terms, very few women came forwards. However, when we went out into the business community and we began to speak to women who we believed were well qualified and could be described as high growth companies, once we got talking to them and about the plans for their businesses and where they were at, they very clearly were categorized as high growth companies, although they didn't see themselves as such. So there was something about the description that was perhaps allowing them or causing them to think about them taking risk and growing the business in a different way than perhaps traditionally might have been considered. Secondly, also in the angel investor space, where individuals investing their money, male or female, want to understand what risk they're taking if they're going to be investing in startup and growing companies. It's certainly been found that women that want to understand risk, they want to understand and be educated about the entire process before taking a risk with their money and making an investment. So it's looking at it from a divergent perspective and really understanding all the factors before taking steps to move forwards. And thirdly, in the corporate space, I see it, the risk being viewed differently, for example, in terms of going for a promotion. For example, and I'm sure many of us have heard the statistics that are quoted, that if a female doesn't believe that they quite meet all the specifications for a job, then they're unlikely to perceive that they should apply for the job. Whereas men see the specifications and believe if they can do 80% of the job, then they're likely to apply for it. Just different approaches. And I've given these 2 examples at the bottom of this slide, certainly from the outdoors perspective. I think that both men and women have the capability to achieve the same outcome. It's how we communicate with them that is different. And this is a key point that leaders have to pay attention to, or coaches have to be cognizant of if they're coaching leaders to be the best that they can be. For example, for some people, if I say, I'm going to climb a mountain, do you want to come along with me? Their hands up there immediately, and they definitely would say yes, and they'd want to come on the journey with me. Those people perhaps might be the more risk tolerant people who have that type of preference. For others, I might say, I'm going out for a walk and I'm going to enjoy the scenery, and it might take us up a hill along the way. Do you want to come? And I wouldn't necessarily focus on the end output, because climbing a mountain for them, they would say, oh, I can't possibly do that. And they wouldn't want to come. But if I just tell them we're going out for a walk, and then we get into conversation along the way, and we're looking at the scenery and we're having a nice chat, before we know where we are, we've gone up the hill and we've managed to achieve the same objective, but we haven't perhaps thought about it in the same way initially. And I think from a coaching perspective, that's definitely worth remembering in terms of encouraging your clients to make any type of change, is what way are you using to describe the change to them? Is it something that the more risk tolerant will be excited by, or the more risk averse might be scared by? So moving on to looking at women running high growth businesses, and this is examples of the risk type compass. These dots on the screen that you can see are people who've actually taken the risk type compass who I've worked with, and you can see there is a real mix across all the different risk types, and it is for me really much about valuing difference. However, the risk type compass and this initial page that you get in the report is not the end of the story. We need to look a little bit deeper. Just as Geoff was talking about with the anchor and the yacht on the surface and the wind blowing, we need to really understand a little bit more about how this plays out in reality. For example, here are two people who've both got carefree risk types. However, they've got very different attitudes to risk depending on what facet of their work and life that you're looking at. For example, the leader on the right here, if you can see your screen, and we're looking at the blue aspect, the blue bit of the pie chart based on reputational risk. The one on the right is a very, very small slice, perhaps not even 10% of the pie, whereas on the left-hand side, the person with their attitude towards reputational risk is well over 15, or at least a quarter of the pie, well over 25%. Now, what I do know is about the individual on the right has grown their business based largely around their own personal reputation. And therefore, my hunch would be that perhaps they're less prone to take a risk with a reputational aspect of their business because their personality is so tied up with the success of the business to date. Similarly, if we look at the intense risk types, here are two people who are both women entrepreneurs with both categorized in their intense risk type. However, again, if you look at their approach to recreational risk, very, very different. The one on the left is a very small sliver. You wouldn't even say that that's 10% of the pie, whereas the one on the right is well over 25% in terms of their attitude towards recreational risk. Again, the individual on the left-hand side, they have a critical role as a specialist within their business. And if that individual was to become ill or be incapacitated, perhaps by doing some risky recreational activity, it might put the sustainability of that company in jeopardy compared to the person on the right-hand side who has a very much more perhaps tolerant or attitude towards taking recreational risk. Whereas one of the other aspects of their pie, for example, social or health and safety, is that much smaller. So it's important not to make judgments based on the initial risk type that we might see about individuals that we're working with or that are part of our team that we're leading. We need to look at more carefully at the nuances to really understand why people behave as they do. So I'm going to come now and explain three case studies and explain how the risk type compass and how the behaviour played out in reality, which I hope will just give you some additional insight into understanding and the benefits of different risk types. So this first case study is an example of influencing upwards. And as you can see in the chart on the left-hand side, the company CEO here with an intense risk type, so that is towards 11 o'clock on the diagram on the right, with more of an emotional focus, as Geoff was mentioning earlier. The company CEO recruited a managing director to shake up a division of the company and to instigate change. The managing director had an adventurous risk type, which is down the bottom at 6 o'clock on the compass on the right-hand side. And that MD was used to going with the flow, being flexible and not following procedures. Now we know, as Geoff said, the risk type can be fearful, and particularly in extreme situations, decision-making for that preference can become an emotional minefield. We also know that the adventurous risk type can be impulsive, and they are not always receptive to taking advice from other people. Well, what happened was, as the managing director here began to drive change through the business in the way that suited their particular risk type, it began to create a conflict between them and the CEO, who began to feel nervous and uncertain. The CEO, as a result, became emotional and began to take things personally, which frustrated the MD, who became more logical and factual. The managing director was aware of how the CEO's emotions seemed to overpower their decision-making. They began to get too involved in the change process, and they didn't allow the CEO, the managing director, sorry, to get on with the job of instigating change. Under this degree of stress, well, what happens was that the managing director dug their heels in, and they began to justify their actions through logic and facts. All that happened was this served to amplify the CEO's fears, who began to really have a very strong concern and a need to be heard and acknowledged. really, in effect, together, they'd lost the ability to connect and communicate together and to have an open and productive conversation. And of course, the change program that the MD had been brought in to deliver had stalled. So in coaching sessions, the MD began to get concerned. That was who I was coaching, the managing director. They were concerned that if they changed their style in order to listen and acknowledge the CEO's concerns, that they would have lost face in some way. That appeared to be a risk for them. So together we explored the situation from a number of different perspectives on the risk type compass, including what someone with an intense risk type might need in order to feel secure, and what someone with an adventurous risk type might need in order to feel empowered. In essence, one needed to be heard and the other needed to be trusted. So by looking at this issue through the lens of risk, the MD realised what they needed to do. And it was really because of adapting their behaviours to address the needs of a person with a different risk type. As a result of this process, the MD began to take a different tack with the CEO, who then began to trust the managing director more. As a result, they were able to get on and deliver and implement the change programme that they had been employed to deliver. And you can see what the key learnings are on the slide in front of you here. The adventurous risk type actually happened to be a male, the managing director. He learned the value of acknowledging the emotional needs of the intense risk type. And he also learned what he needed to do in order to get a clearer sense of buy-in from other people who may be more risk averse to where he was with his risk preference. Similarly, the CEO, the intense risk type, she was a female. She learned that she needed to exhibit trust in other people and to not take things personally. And she also learned that her emotions could get in the way of her making rational decisions, and developed then strategies for managing her emotions more effectively. So I'll go on to the second case study, and this is one more from an entrepreneurial background. Now, this is an example of an adventurous risk type coming up against a composed risk type. Now, this CEO of this fast-growing entrepreneurial company, both females in this instance, the CEO had an adventurous risk type. Now, she had successfully grown the business over the last 10 years by spotting new market opportunities and going after them. Very entrepreneurial, adventurous characteristics. She was always optimistic and willing to adapt to the changing market conditions. Now, that can sometimes leave employees a little bit confused as to what the direction the company is heading in, because it keeps changing tack. However, the CEO decided to recruit a marketing director to help increase product awareness and to develop the brand. The marketing director was a composed risk type who appeared calm, unruffled, and well organised. The marketing director had come from a corporate background and was used to working on big accounts with large budgets. Well, you can imagine what happened. On day one, the first question from the marketing director to the CEO was, what is the marketing budget? This simple question caused the CEO a little bit of concern. She was so used to being entrepreneurial and just going after the next opportunity, she'd never actually really set a marketing budget. In fact, she expected other people to justify any spend by explaining the potential benefits, rather than assuming that the money was in place already. It actually made her slightly fearful that the composed risk type would be too organised and steady and wouldn't even show concern for possible risks if they made a marketing decision that turned out to be costly and perhaps a mistake. After all, it wasn't the marketing director's money that was being spent. It was only after we talked through this situation, using something like the risk type compass, that the CEO realised that her adventurous risk type may not be the most appropriate type to have in every aspect of the business. In fact, maybe there was something good about having somebody who had a different risk type to her, and in fact a more composed risk type, somebody who was less likely to dart from one opportunity to another. It also forced the CEO to sit with the marketing director to talk through her ideas for the business strategy and where she'd like the company to be in 12 months' time. By doing this, it gave clear direction to the marketing director, which meant that she actually could be far more effective in her role. And the CEO also recognised that actually, when she was able to set that direction and give clarity to her team member, she was able to then focus on other areas, knowing that the marketing was being taken care of, which was a great relief to her. So I hope in that example, again, you can see that different risk types, by understanding and valuing the diversity that a different approach to risk might have in your business, can be of value by taking time to pay attention to the things that are important to that person. So I'd like you to take a moment or two to think about what I've been talking about so far, and maybe about how this might apply in your working life, whether it's directly or indirectly to you. Maybe it might cause you to think about situations where the situations have caused you to value people who actually have different risk types to you. I know certainly with I have an adventurous risk type, and when I've been on expeditions with people who are more prudent and wary, I certainly am glad that they're there when we're coming up to face a crevasse or a polar bear, and I know that they've forced us as a group to talk through what the implications and what we should do if we face those challenges, rather than just blindly going along enthusiastically and not worrying about the situation until we come across it. So I've definitely learned to value people who have different risk types to me in those high risk and challenging situations. Maybe it's also caused you to think about a time where you've had conflict with other people, perhaps as a leader or when you're working for a leader yourself, and to what extent those types of situations maybe would have been resolved by a better awareness of that individual's risk type, and also your own. So before I go on to the final case study, I might be inviting you to think about any questions that are coming up for you from what you've heard so far, because after that we will have a moment to take one or two questions. So on to the final case study. This is one example of a wary risk type, and this is from the corporate world. So this female executive working in the corporate world was one level below C-suite or board level, and had been told that she needed to raise her profile in order to be considered for senior management opportunities. Before that, she had worked very diligently, delivering results, and thought that if she did a good job, she would get noticed, that was enough. In fact, she was quite resistant to doing any sort of networking because she didn't like the way that her male colleagues approached this activity. Now, with a wary risk type, which was her preference, I know that individuals in this category, if you like, may tend to be, she was certainly organised, she was unadventurous, and she would be attracted to the idea of securing her future, but not if it meant taking too many risks. Now, as the coach in this instance, my challenge was how could I encourage her to take some action to raise her profile that would be in a way comfortable enough for her to embark upon. I knew that any plan that we devised would have to fit in with her need for security, as she was fairly risk averse, and she would also want to have some evidence of how it had worked or where it had worked before she embarked on taking action herself. Well, using the risk type compass as a backdrop to our conversation, we discussed what might be the worst thing that could happen if she decided to do some networking. I also asked her a question: which risk was greater, doing nothing versus taking action? Now, she'd never thought about doing nothing as actually a possible risk to her career. So this was a pretty powerful question for her. Now, from my experience, that when somebody has a wary risk type, they want to start from what is known, what is familiar to them, and move from there, as opposed to jumping into the unknown and seeing what happens. So I asked her to explain to me what networking meant to her. And she said it was all about developing, maintaining relationships, and making connections, being the connector. And if some of her more senior colleagues got to know her better, then they might have a stronger idea of her capabilities and begin to imagine her in a more senior role. Well, it was during this conversation, she talked about a party she had hosted at home for her neighbours at the weekend. It had been a great success, and she was able to connect them to one another. All of her neighbours knew her, but they hadn't necessarily known each other. So in order for me to start with the known for this individual, I asked her to consider if what she did at the party could be viewed as networking. Suddenly, the light bulb went on for her, and she agreed with me. So now she was able to connect what was already known to her in terms of doing networking, albeit in a different world, with going into the unknown in the corporate world. And the idea that beginning to make connections and develop relationships at work suddenly began to seem possible rather than impossible. From that start point, we were able to then create a structured plan for her to follow over the next 3 months. And actually, the story ended by her not only getting an opportunity to go for a more senior position, but having the confidence to negotiate an even better salary when she got the job offer. So I learned that about encouraging people with behaviour to take some sort of form of behaviour change when they have a wary risk type is often useful to connect the future with the past knowledge of what is done in the past. And that powerful question about what if you do nothing can also be something that works really well. So finally, I'd just like to wrap up by saying, for me, I think one of the things I've learned over the years is that all risk types have value. So we need to understand what the different risk types are and the propensity for risk taking that they all bring to the table. I think it's also important to communicate with others from a leadership perspective. If we want to get them to follow us as a leader, we have to start with their risk type and communicate in a way that's going to suit them, not from our own perspective of the world. And then lastly, a tool like the risk type compass can bring a common language within an organisation or a team to help people to understand and to develop other people. So if you've hopefully enjoyed what I've had to say this morning or this afternoon, depending on where you are in the world, what we are going to put into the webinar, when you get sent the recording of this afterwards, you'll get a free sampler of a chapter of the book that Clive Steeper and myself wrote on the subject of risk. And the chapter that we've included has also got information about the risk type compass in it. So it will give you perhaps some additional reading and thought-provoking material. So I'll hand back now to Geoff and Jackie to finish off the webinar.
That's great. Thank you very much, Sue. So we've got some questions come in, and please feel free to add any more if you've got anything to ask Geoff or Sue. Okay, so the first question that we have is, should companies ensure that they have a range of risk types on the board? Sue, do you want to answer that one?
Yes, I can certainly give my view on this. I don't necessarily think it's a necessity that everyone does a risk type compass in their recruitment decisions. However, I do think that by understanding and valuing that diversity is useful. So if we're, particularly companies these days, where very often innovation is something that's sought after, new ideas, instigating change within a boardroom and moving a company forwards, that you do need to have people who are going to be perhaps a little bit more adventurous and a little bit more carefree, and so that they don't get sort of too carried away with their adventurous ideas. It's, having the value of the prudent and the wary and those other types that are perhaps a little bit more risk averse is to ask those challenging questions so that there is just a balanced viewpoint to a discussion. So I think, like anything, we all have our Achilles heel depending on what our risk type is, and therefore how do we address that? If we have all the same risk type in a team, we have to ensure that we've got somebody in there that's asking questions from a different perspective.
Okay, great, thank you, Sue. So the next one, to what extent does your organisation's culture impact your risk type? Geoff, do you want to answer that one?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I think we found working in various sectors that companies do develop a culture which often reflects the predominant risk type within the organisation. And you can see this, for example, in a tax office. I can remember visiting when we were looking for alternative premises, and the atmosphere was absolutely quiet. Everybody was busy at what they were doing. They didn't pay very much attention to us going around, just getting on with their work. And then that was contrasted. We went to another company where people were involved with promotion and advertising. And as soon as you walked in the door, people were almost climbing over the desk to say, hi, who are you, what do you do, what's your interest, and so on. So yeah, culture is sometimes really palpable within an organisation. And obviously when you're working with them, you get tuned into those subtleties. I think the point about your own risk type then is, how does that relate to the organisational risk type, if there is a strong risk type culture in the organisation? And that's what sets you the challenge. You have, as Sue was saying, you have to bridge the gap between where you are and where you want to be. And if you're particularly anxious to get on well in that organisation, whatever your risk type, you will make some effort to fit in, particularly initially when you first join the company. So I think it's that point about risk type being your own personal agenda, You joining the company is a different proposition from somebody else joining the company who's a very different risk type than you are. And each of you would have to navigate your own way. So as we said at the beginning, risk type doesn't stop you behaving other ways, but it sets the challenge and it lets you know what it is you've got to manage if it isn't a natural disposition in order to get on well in that setting.
Thanks, Geoff. And so another one we've got here is, I think this for you as well, Geoff, is the risk type compass based on the 5-factor model of personality?
Oh yeah, when we started out with the risk type compass, we had appreciated that there was this strong relationship between personality and risk taking that's come up in all sorts of research, and really a huge amount of research which reflects that, and sometimes very, very strong relationships. So what we did was we went to the 5-factor model of personality. If you're not familiar with that, it's the framework really which is absolutely current in the world of personality assessment and personality research. It's had a huge influence. It's something that came to light, it came back to prominence, but backed by huge amounts of data about 15, 20 years ago. And that has really shaped things. So the 5-factor model really gives you the whole range of personality dispositions which are relevant in the world of personality. And so we went back to that model and we extracted all of the themes within it that had anything to do with risk taking or with reaction to risk. So that was the origin. So we were building, the risk that comes effectively is built on all of that research which was evident in the 5-factor model. And we then took out those bits, got the data on it, refactor analysed what we had, which was the extracted risk type component, and developed the tool, which turns out to have very, very good psychometric qualities in the sense that the scales are very, very, very reliable and very evenly distributed. But it owes something to the 5-factor model, definitely.
Okay, so I think that is everything. Thank you very much to Geoff and to Sue, and for everyone for joining the presentations. We hope that you found them interesting. And as Sue mentioned, we'll be circulating a link to the recording and to a copy of the slides via email. So thank you very much and goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.